The mist, thick as a shepherd's lost dream, clung to the mountains surrounding Lochdub, promising a day of soft rain and even softer ambitions. PC Hamish Macbeth, a man whose ambition had long since been misplaced somewhere between a comfortable armchair and a well-steeped cup of tea, was currently enacting his morning ritual. This involved leaning back in his creaking desk chair, feet propped precariously on the worn surface of his police station desk, and staring out the window at the pewter-grey sky. He wasn't, strictly speaking, working. A pile of unfiled reports sat accusingly to his right, a testament to his unique approach to law enforcement in the Highlands. His police radio, a tinny, crackling harbinger of unwanted activity, was thankfully silent. Hamish took another slow, appreciative sip of his milky coffee, a concoction brewed with a disregard for strength that would make any city-dweller wince. The aroma, nevertheless, was comforting, a small shield against the dank chill that seeped into the very bones of the old station house. His dog, Lugs, a West Highland white terrier whose intelligence was inversely proportional to his enthusiasm, snored softly under the desk, occasionally twitching a paw as if chasing phantom sheep. Hamish, ever the connoisseur of quiet, found the rhythm of Lug's slumber deeply soothing. The phone, a shrill and intrusive beast, chose that moment to shatter the peace. Hamish winced, his hand moving as if in slow motion towards the receiver. It would be Blair, no doubt, bellowing about some minor infraction, or, worse, demanding his presence in Strathbane. The thought of a city filled with impatient people and relentless paperwork made his stomach churn. Lochdub Police Station, he drawled into the phone, his voice thick with a carefully cultivated lethargy. It wasn't Blair, thank heavens. It was Mrs. Morag McCurdy, the postmistress, her voice a rapid-fire assault of gossip and thinly veiled disapproval. "Hamish, dear, have you heard?" There's a new one. A Sassenach, and a right proper piece of work, too, by the sound of it. From London, they say. Hamish sighed. Another one. Lochdub, in its rugged, unassuming beauty, had an unfortunate habit of attracting outsiders, those with too much money and too little sense of decorum. They'd arrive in their flashy cars, with their even flashier opinions, and proceed to upset the delicate balance of village life. "Oh, I?" Hamish mumbled, feigning disinterest. He knew Morag wouldn't be deterred. Indeed, just bought the old Mac Tavish cottage, the one with the leaky roof and the ghost of the shepherd who lost his prize ram. He's called, wait for it, Mr. Alistair Finch, and he's brought a dreadful modern motorcar, all shiny and red, blocking half the road already. Morag paused, allowing Hamish a brief, glorious moment of silence before continuing her breathless report. And he asked for directions to the best organic butcher. Organic, as if our own Donald isn't good enough, with his pigs fed on the finest Highland slop. Hamish could almost picture Mr. Finch, immaculately dressed, probably with a perfectly coiffed haircut that would stand no chance against a true Highland squall. He'd be the type to complain about the internet speed, the lack of decaffeinated soya lattes, and the charmingly unpredictable weather. "I am sure hell settle in," Hamish offered, a polite platitude that held no real conviction. "Settle in?" He's already ruffled feathers. Tried to haggle with Mrs. Gillespie over her prize-winning shortbread recipe at the village fete. He did. Said it was too rustic. Too rustic indeed! I tell you, Hamish, it's going to be trouble. Mark my words. Morag, as always, was probably right. Trouble had a way of finding Lochdub, and when it wasn't the weather or a particularly stubborn sheep, it was usually a Sassenach with more money than sense. Hamish drained his coffee, a faint sense of unease stirring in his usually placid mind. He stretched, disturbing Lugs, who grumbled softly. "Well, thank you for the update, Morag," Hamish said, trying to sound appropriately concerned. "I'll keep an eye out for Mr. Finch." He hung up, the faint click echoing in the quiet station. He wasn't just going to keep an eye out. He was going to avoid Mr. Finch as long as humanly possible. The new arrivals always brought disruption, and Hamish, in his heart of hearts, cherished nothing more than an undisturbed existence. He pictured the red sports car, a garish splash of colour against the muted greens and greys of the Highlands, and felt a premonition of bother. "Lugs," he murmured to his still grumbling dog, "it seems our peace and quiet is under threat." He stood up, stretching his lanky frame, and ambled towards the kettle, a fresh brew already calling. If he was going to face an influx of Sassenach-induced aggravation, he'd need a good supply of tea. The kettle had only just begun its reluctant whistle when the station door was flung open with such violence that the glass rattled in its frame. Hamish didn't jump. That would have required a level of physical exertion he wasn't prepared to commit. Tobbot, he did raise a sandy eyebrow as he turned. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked as though he had been airdropped into Lochdub from the middle of a Mayfair gentlemen's club. He was dressed in a pristine tweed jacket that had clearly never seen a day's hard wear, and his face was a shade of puce that matched the garish red sports car Hamish had heard about only moments before. "Are you the local constabulary?" the man demanded, his voice a clipped, high-pitched bray that seemed to bounce off the stone walls. Hamish leaned against the counter, his expression one of mild bovine confusion. "I am PC Hamish Macbeth, sir. And you would be?" "Alistair Finch. I've just moved into that hovel on the hill," Finch snapped, waving a manicured hand vaguely toward the mist-shrouded peaks. "I was told this village was a sanctuary of peace, not a den of thieves and vandals." Hamish took a slow, deliberate sip of his freshly poured tea, letting the steam dampen his face. "Vandals, sir. That's a heavy word for Lochdub. The worst we usually get is a sheep with a grudge or a teenager with a stolen bicycle. Someone has spray-painted 'Go Home' across my garage door," Finch yelled, his eyes bulging. "And they've left our dead fish on my doorstep. Salmon. It's an outrage." Hamish's ears pricked up at the mention of the salmon. A good fish was hard to come by this time of year without a bit of illicit nighttime wading, and leaving one to rot on a doorstep felt like a terrible waste of butter and lemon. "A salmon, you say? Was it a large one?" Finch stared at him, incredulous. "Is that all you have to say?" "I want an investigation. I want fingerprints. I want someone in handcuffs." Now, Mr. Finch," Hamish said, his voice dropping into the soft, rhythmic lilt he used to soothe agitated tourists and angry farmers alike. "Things work a bit differently here. We'll have to look, of course. Perhaps it was just a local misunderstanding. A welcoming gift gone a bit awry." "A welcoming gift?" Finch sputtered. "It was a threat, you carrot-topped simpleton." Hamish winced inwardly at the insult, but kept his face a mask of dull-witted helpfulness. He whistled for Lugs, who emerged from under the desk with a yawn that showed every one of his teeth. The walk up to the old Mac Tavish cottage would be long, damp, and thoroughly unpleasant, but there was no avoiding it now. He grabbed his peaked cap and followed the fuming Mr. Finch out into the drizzle. The scene at the cottage was exactly as described, though even more jarring against the ancient, weathered stone. The red paint on the garage door was still tacky, the letters jagged and angry. And there, lying in the centre of the pristine gravel driveway, was the salmon. It was a magnificent silver beast, easily 10 pounds, its scales shimmering even in the grey light. Hamish knelt beside it, ignoring the theatrical huffing of Mr. Finch. "A fine fish," Hamish muttered to himself. He noticed a small piece of twine tied around the tail, a specific noted double hitch that felt familiar. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers, and looked around the property. The mist was rolling down from the heights of Ben Bulb, swirling around the chimneys. Everything felt silent, expectant. "Well?" Finch demanded. "Are you going to arrest someone?" "He'll need to make some inquiries, sir," Hamish said, his eyes scanning the tree line. "In the meantime, I suggest you wash that door. And as for the fish, well, it would be a shame to let it go to waste." Finch looked ready to explode, but before he could launch into another tirade, a scream tore through the damp air. It wasn't a scream of anger or frustration, but a high, thin wail of genuine terror. It came from the back of the cottage, near the old stone well that had been boarded up for decades. Hamish moved with a sudden, startling fluidity that Finch didn't expect, rounding the corner of the house with Lugs at his heels. There, standing by the well, was a young woman, Finch's secretary perhaps, or a very expensive niece. She was pointing a trembling finger at the edge of the well. The heavy wooden boards had been shoved aside, and a pair of polished, hand-made Italian loafers was sticking out from the dark opening, the legs attached to them motionless. Hamish stepped forward, his heart sinking. The piece of Lochdub hadn't just been ruffled, it had been shattered. He peered into the depths of the well. Below, wedged between the cold stone walls, was a man. He was wearing a dinner jacket, completely out of place in the morning mist, and his head was tilted at an impossible angle. But it wasn't just the fall that had killed him. Sticking out of the centre of his chest was a silver-handled letter opener, the pommel shaped like a soaring eagle, very same eagle Hamish had seen on Alistair Finch's desk only moments before. "Oh, dear," Hamish sighed, the sound lost in the rising wind. "That's going to be an awful lot of paperwork." The rain began to fall in earnest then, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the old stone of the cottage that seemed to mock the stillness of the man in the well. Hamish stood at the edge, his hands deep in the pockets of his uniform jacket, his face a mask of careful neutrality. Beside him, Alistair Finch had gone from a vibrant, furious puce to a sickly, curdled grey. The young woman who had screamed was now slumped against the damp stone wall of the house, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Hamish knew he should say something comforting, something professional, but his mind was already racing through the logistical nightmare that was about to descend upon Lochdub. A murder in the village was never just a murder, it was an invitation for the heavy-handed machinery of the Strathbane police to grind his peaceful existence into the dirt. "Don't touch anything, Mr. Finch," Hamish said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Not the well, not the well, not the boards, and certainly not that letter opener." I've never seen that man before in my life," Finch stammered, his eyes darting toward the silver eagle pommel glinting in the depths. "And that's my opener. It was on my desk this morning. Someone must have stolen it." Hamish didn't answer. He was busy looking at the ground. The gravel near the well was disturbed, but the rain was already washing away any clear prints. Lugs, usually so boisterous, was sitting perfectly still, his black nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Dogs knew when death had arrived, Hamish thought gloomily. They didn't need a badge to tell them the world had tipped off its axis. He reached for his radio, the heavy plastic cold against his palm, and keyed the mic. He had to report it. There was no way to hide a body in a well, especially not one wearing Italian loafers and a dinner jacket. The response from headquarters was almost instantaneous, and it wasn't the voice of the dispatcher he feared. It was the roar of a man who viewed Hamish Macbeth as a personal affront to the dignity of the Scottish police service. Within the hour, the quiet lane leading to the Mac Tavish cottage was choked with white and blue patrol cars, their sirens wailing unnecessarily loudly as they crested the Bree. Leading the charge was a black sedan that screeched to a halt on the gravel, nearly clipping Finch's red sports car. Detective Chief Inspector Blair erupted from the vehicle before it had even stopped rocking. He was a slab of a man, his suit straining against a torso fueled by fried breakfasts and unearned arrogance. His face was already a dangerous shade of crimson, and his eyes scanned the scene with a hunger for someone to blame. He ignored Finch and the sobbing woman, marching straight toward Hamish, who was standing by the well with the resigned air of a man waiting for a bus that was already an hour late. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the hills. "What have you done now? I left you alone in this god-forsaken puddle of a village for 5 minutes, and you managed to find a body. Did you trip over it while you were out poaching, you useless peasant?" "The body is in the well, sir," Hamish replied, his voice dropping into that deceptively slow, thick Highland burr that always drove Blair into a frenzy. "Mr. Finch here found it, or rather, his associate did. It appears to be a murder, sir. There's a letter opener in the chest." Blair shoved Hamish aside, peering into the well with a grunt of distaste. "A letter opener? How quaint. I suppose you think you're in an Agatha Christie novel, don't you? This is real police work, Macbeth. Not that you'd know anything about that." He turned his gaze toward Finch, who was trembling. "And who are you? The butler? I am Alistair Finch. I own this property," Finch cried, his voice cracking. "And that implementation, it belongs to me. But I didn't put it there." Blair's eyes lit up. He smelled blood, and more importantly, he smelled a quick arrest that would get him back to the pubs of Strathbane before closing time. "Owned the weapon, did you? And the body's on your land. Well, it doesn't take a genius to put two and two together, does it, Jimmy?" He gestured to Detective Sergeant Jimmy Anderson, who was busy trying to light a cigarette in the rain. "Get the cuffs, Jimmy. We've found our man before the body's even cold." Hamish cleared his throat, a small, polite sound. "Begging your pardon, sir, but the man in the well, he's wearing a dinner jacket, in the middle of the morning. And Mr. Finch here says he doesn't know him. Seems a bit odd, don't you think? To kill a stranger with your own letter opener, and then leave him in your own front yard." Blair turned on Hamish, his finger jabbing into the air inches from Hamish's nose. "I don't pay you to think, Macbeth. In fact, I don't pay you at all if I can help it. You're a village bobby. Your job is to direct traffic and find lost kittens. Leave the thinking to the professionals. This is an open and shut case. Finch here had a falling out with his fancy friend, stuck him with the eagle, and dumped him. End of story." Hamish looked at the rain-slicked gravel, then at the terrified Finch, and finally at the body in the well. He saw something Blair had missaid a small, blue thread snagged on the rough stone of the well's edge, a colour that didn't match Finch tweed or the victim's black jacket, but he said nothing. He simply stepped back, letting Blair's team swarm the scene like angry hornets. He knew Blair would spend the next several hours bullying the wrong person, which gave Hamish exactly the opening he needed. He whistled for lugs and began to wander away from the cottage, heading toward the village. It was time for a cup of tea, a bit of gossip, and a very long listen to the things the people of Lochdub weren't saying. The heavy, wet soles of Hamish's boots crunched rhythmically on the road as he descended from the Mac Tavish cottage, leaving the chaos of flashing blue lights and Blair's booming accusations behind him. The DCI's voice, still carrying on the wind, was a jagged contrast to the soft, ancient silence of the glen. To an observer, Hamish looked like a man defeated, a lazy village policeman retreating to the safety of a warm hearth, while the real detectives handled the heavy lifting. In reality, Hamish's mind was sorting through the visual fragments of the crime scene, like a man organizing a chaotic deck of cards. He knew that if he stayed, Blair would only use him as a verbal punching bag or, worse, order him to stand guard in the rain for 12 hours. By leaving, he became invisible, and in Lochstub, being invisible was the most effective way to see. Luggs trotted ahead, his white coat now a dismal shade of grey from the Highland mud. They reached the main cluster of buildings that made up the village, where the scent of peat smoke and damp wool hung heavy in the air. Hamish didn't head for the station instead. He steered his path toward the general store and post office. He knew that by now, the news of the body in the well would have travelled faster than a golden eagle on the hunt. Mrs. Morag McCurdy would be the epicentre of the information storm, and she was always more forthcoming when there was a pot of tea involved. As he pushed open the door, the bell gave a cheerful chime that felt entirely inappropriate given the morning's discoveries. The shop was crowded, more than usual on a Tuesday. Archie McLean, the local fisherman, was leaning against the counter. Patel from the curry shop was deep in whispered conversation with Mrs. Gillespie. The silence that fell as Hamish entered was instantaneous and heavy. Every eye was on him, searching for the grim details that would fuel the villagers' dinner conversations for a month. "Well, Hamish?" Morag asked, her hands frozen over a stack of newspapers. "Is it true? A man in a suit, dead in the old well? They say his throat was cut from ear to ear." Hamish let out a long, weary sigh and leaned against the counter, looking for all the world like a man who had seen too much and understood too little. "Not quite, Morag, but it's a bad business, surely. A stranger, by the look of him. Mr. Finch is in a terrible state, and Blair from Strathbane is up there now, making a right mess of the gravel." "Finch!" Archie snorted, crossing his arms. "That man's been asking for trouble since he arrived. Arrogant as a peacock and twice as loud. I saw him yesterday down by the harbour, shouting at the tourists for taking photos of his car. Said it was private property. The road's public, I told him, but he wouldn't listen." Hamish nodded vaguely, his eyes wandering to the shelf of tinned goods. He's a peculiar man, right enough. But this fellow in the well-tall dark hair, wearing a dinner jacket like Head just stepped out of a ballroom. Does that ring a bell for anyone? Maybe someone is staying at the hotel? Patel shook his head, his brow furrowed in thought. "I had a party of 4 last night for the late sitting. All locals, except for a travelling salesman who's been coming here for years. No one in a dinner jacket. Hamish. This isn't exactly the place for black tie affairs, unless you're counting the minister's retirement party, and that was 3 years ago." "A dinner jacket?" Mrs. Gillespie chimed in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Wait now. I saw a man like that. It was late, mind well past 11. I was taking the bins out, and a car went past, one of those quiet, expensive ones. It didn't stop in the village. It went straight to the old Mac Tavish place. I thought it was just more of Mr. Finch, flashy friends coming to celebrate his move." Hamish shifted his weight, his interest sharpening, though his face remained a mask of mild boredom. "Did you see the driver, Mrs. Gillespie? Or the colour of the car? It was dark blue, I think. Or black. But there was something odd. The car didn't have its full lights on, just the small ones. It looked like it was trying to be sneaky." "And the man?" Hamish prompted gently. "I only saw a glimpse as they passed the street lamp. He was in the passenger seat. Very stiff he looked, staring straight ahead. I remember thinking he looked far too formal for a drive in the rain." Hamish accepted a cup of tea from Morag, the warmth of the porcelain seeping into his cold fingers. He took a slow sip, listening as the villagers began to speculate wildly. Behind the talk of ghosts and curses, a pattern was beginning to emerge. The blue thread he had seen on the well, the blue car Mrs. Gillespie had spotted, and the fact that the victim was already in formal wear suggested the murder hadn't happened at the cottage at all. The body had been delivered there. "Aye, well," Hamish muttered, setting his cup down. "I'd best be getting back before Blair notices I've gone missing. He's already convinced it's Mr. Finch, and he doesn't like his theories being disturbed by things like facts." As he stepped back out into the mist, Hamish felt the weight of the mystery pressing in. He needed a sounding board, someone who understood the nuances of the upper-class arrivals better than he did. He looked toward the sprawling estate on the edge of the village. It's time to visit Halberton Smythe's. If anyone knew about mysterious men in dinner jackets and late-night arrivals in dark blue cars, it would be Priscilla. The walk to Tommel Castle was a long one, designed to discourage the casual visitor, but Hamish found the distance useful for clearing the cobwebs of Blair's shouting from his mind. The rain had settled into a fine, pervasive Scottish haar that coated his uniform in a glistening sheen of moisture. Lugs, sensing the change in destination, had regained some of his spirit, trotting ahead toward the grand Rortian gates that marked the entrance to the Halbertons' Mythe estate. As Hamish approached the great stone house, he felt the usual familiar twinge of inadequacy, a mixture of his own humble station and the persistent, unresolved ache that always accompanied the thought of Priscilla. He found her in the conservatory, a glass-walled sanctuary filled with exotic ferns and the civilized scent of damp earth and expensive tea. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was as she always was, perfectly composed, her blonde hair caught in a casual but elegant knot, and her eyes holding that spark of intelligence that Hamish found both captivating and intimidating. She looked up from her book as he entered, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "I heard the sirens, Hamish," she said, her voice like cool silk. "And given that I can see DCI Blair's car from the upper windows, I assumed it wouldn't be long before you came looking for a sanctuary or a lead." Hamish took off his cap and ran a hand through his damp ginger hair. "It's a bad business, Priscilla. Old Mac Tavish Wellman, a stranger in a dinner jacket, no less. Blair has already decided that Alistair Finch is the culprit, because Finch owns the letter opener that's currently lodged in the poor soul's chest." Priscilla set her book aside, her expression becoming serious. "A dinner jacket? That's rather specific for a morning discovery in Lochstub. Was he wearing a sapphire blue silk pocket square by any chance?" Hamish blinked, his slow blinking deception momentarily failing him. "He was indeed. How could you possibly know that?" "Because there was a dinner party last night at the Sutherland estate, just over the ridge," Priscilla explained, rising to pour him a cup of tea that actually tasted of tea, rather than the grey sludge he brewed at the station. "It was a very exclusive, very hush-hush affair. My father was invited, though he declined due to his gout. The guest of honour was a man named Julian Vanno. Wait, no, I shouldn't use that. Namehe was a man named Quentin Graves, a London financier who has been looking to buy up half the Highland coastline for a luxury resort." Hamish took the cup, the warmth a welcome relief. "Quentin Graves. And I take it Mr. Graves was a man of expensive tastes and perhaps a few enemies." "More than a few," Priscilla said, leaning against the wicker table. "He was notoriously ruthless. But what's interesting, Hamish, is that Graves wasn't supposed to be leaving the party alone. He arrived with a man who acted as his shadow, a quiet, unremarkable fellow named Arthur Penhaligon. My father mentioned that Graves and Penhaligon had a rather public disagreement over a contract during the first course. It was quite the scandal for a Sutherland dinner." Hamish digested this, the image of the blue thread from the well and the dark blue car Mrs. Gillespie had seen finally clicking into place. And did this Penhaligon drive a dark blue car, perhaps a Continental or something equally quiet and expensive? "Exactly," Priscilla nodded. "But there's something else you should know. Alistair Finch isn't just a random Sassenach who moved in. He was Graves' chief rival in the resort bidding war. If Graves is dead, Finch stands to inherit the entire development project by default." Hamish let out a long, low whistle. "So Blair might actually be right for once, even if he's right for all the wrong reasons. Finch has the motive, and the weapon was his." "Perhaps," Priscilla mused, her eyes narrowing. "But Finch is a coward, Hamish. He's the type to sue you or shout at you, not the type to heave a body into a well in the dead of night. He lacks the physical stamina and, frankly, the imagination. Besides, why use his own letter opener? It's far too theatrical. Unless someone wanted it to look exactly like the theatrical blunder of an arrogant man," Hamish added softly. He looked at Priscilla, feeling the familiar tug of partnership that always made him wish, just for a moment, that he was the kind of man who wanted a promotion. "You've given me a lot to think about, Priscilla. Blair is currently trying to sweat a confession out of Finch at the station. I think I'll go see if I can find where Mr. Penhaligon has disappeared to." "Be careful, Hamish," Priscilla warned, her hand briefly brushing his arm as she saw him to the door. "If this is about a multi-million-pound resort, a letter opener might only be the beginning." Hamish stepped back out into the mist, his mind turning over the sapphire blue pocket square and the rivalry between the dead man and the living suspect. He had his lead, but he knew he couldn't go to Blair with it. Blair would only accuse him of making up stories to protect a fellow gentleman. No, he would have to do this the Lochstub way quickly, slowly, and with a great deal of tea. The mist had transformed into a heavy, drenching downpour by the time Hamish trudged back toward the village, the grey towers of Tommel Castle disappearing into the gloom behind him. The information Priscilla had provided sat in his mind like a heavy stone in a pool, creating ripples that refused to settle. If Quentin Graves was the man in the well, and Arthur Penhaligon had been his disgruntled shadow, The presence of Alistair Finch's letter opener became less of a smoking gun and more of a neon sign pointing in a suspicious direction. Hamish knew he had to return to the station, not to help Blair, but to observe the fallout. He needed to see exactly how much of a hole the DCI was digging for himself. As he entered the station, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool and Blair's cheap tobacco. The DCI was in the small interview room, his voice a muffled roar that could be heard through the heavy oak door. Every few seconds, a high-pitched, hysterical sob from Alistair Finch punctuated the interrogation. Detective Sergeant Jimmy Anderson was sitting at Hamish's desk, looking bored and leafing through a month-old copy of a fishing magazine. "He's still at it then?" Hamish asked, shaking his wet cap and hanging it on the peg. "Going on 2 hours," Anderson sighed, not looking up. "The chief's got him dead to rights, Hamish. Finch's fingerprints are all over that silver eagle, and we found a blood-stained handkerchief in his laundry basket. Case closed. We'll be back in Strathbane by supper." Hamish paused, his hand frozen on the kettle's handle. "A blood-stained handkerchief? That's very convenient, Jimmy. Almost too convenient for a man who's been screaming about organic butchers and the lack of proper decaf. Did you check the blood type?" "Why bother?" Anderson shrugged. "It's a match for the scene. Besides, Blair's already calling the super to brag about the fastest arrest in Highland history." Hamish said nothing. He moved toward the evidence locker, which Blair had sloppily left unlocked in his haste to begin the interrogation. Inside, sitting in a plastic bag, was the handkerchief. It was a fine linen thing, embroidered with the initials AF. It was indeed stained with a dark, brownish smear. Hamish leaned closer, his nose twitching. There was a faint, familiar scent clinging to the fabric knot, the metallic tang of human blood, but something sharper, something almost fruity. "Lugs, come here," Hamish whispered. The terrier trotted over and gave the bag a single, disinterested sniff before turning away to lick a damp paw. Hamish's eyes narrowed. Had it been fresh human blood, Lugs would have been much more interested. He slipped out of the station through the back door, heading toward the small row of cottages where Donald the butcher lived. The village was quiet, the residents tucked away from the storm, but Donald was in his shed, sharpening a cleaver with rhythmic precision. "Donald," Hamish said, leaning against the doorframe. "A quick question for you. That salmon left on Mr. Finch's doorstep this morning. Did you sell it to anyone recently?" Donald looked up, his face as weathered as a Highland crag. "I did not, Hamish. That fish was poached from the Sutherland estate waters. I'd know those scales anywhere. But I'll tell you what's odd. Someone came by yesterday asking for a pint of pig's blood. Said they were making a traditional black pudding for a city guest. I told them I didn't have any to spare until Thursday. And who was asking? That quiet fellow staying at the hotel. The one with the dark blue car. Penhaligon. Hamish felt the final piece of the red herring click into place. The blood on the handkerchief wasn't Gravis. It was a plant, likely animal blood, or even a clever chemical substitute, intended to give Blair the slam-dunk evidence he craved. The letter opener had been stolen during the fete, and the handkerchief had been planted to ensure Finch took the fall. He walked back to the station, his mind settling. Blair was currently in the process of arresting an innocent man based on evidence that had been practically gift-wrapped for him. The real killer, Arthur Penhaligon, was likely long gone, or worse, watching the spectacle from the safety of the hotel, waiting for the police to clear out so he could finish whatever business Graves had started. Hamish entered the station just as Blair emerged from the interview room, looking triumphant and mopping his brow. "There he is," the village idiot returns. "You're too late, Macbeth. Finch has cracked. He's admitted the letter opener is his, and we've got the blood. Get the van ready, we're taking him in." "I wouldn't do that just yet, sir," Hamish said, his voice deceptively mild as he began to stir a fresh pot of tea. "I think Yow'll find that blood on the handkerchief has a very interesting story to tell, and it doesn't involve a murder." Blair's face began to turn that familiar, dangerous shade of purple. "And what, pray tell, does the great Macbeth know that the entire Strathbane CID has missed?" "I know that Mr. Finch has a terrible allergy to seafood," Hamish lied smoothly, knowing Blair wouldn't check. "And I know that the blood on that cloth smells suspiciously like the red wine reduction they serve up at the hotel. If you arrest him now, the lawyers will have your head on a platter by morning." Blair froze, the doubt flickering in his eyes just long enough for Hamish to know he had won a reprieve. He didn't need to prove Penhaligon was the killer, yet he just needed to stop Blair from closing the door on the truth. Blair's roar of indignation was cut short by the sheer audacity of Hamish's claim. The DCI stood with his hand frozen on the door handle of the interview room, his jaw working silently as he processed the possibility of a humiliating legal blunder. He looked at the evidence bag, then back at Hamish's inscrutable, ginger-lashed face. The threat of a lawyer, specifically a high-priced London one, representing a wealthy man like Finch was the only thing capable of piercing Blair's thick hide. He let go of the door, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure malice. "You'd better be right about this, Macbeth," Blair hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "If I find out you're stalling to protect this Sassenach, it'll have you directing traffic in the middle of a peat bog in Shetland. Anderson, hold off on the paperwork. We're going to the hotel. I want to see this wine reduction for myself." As the Strathbane team piled into their cars and screeched away toward the Lochdub Arms, Hamish stood alone in the sudden ringing silence of the station. He hadn't told Blair about Penhaligon yet. He knew that if he did, Blair would simply charge into the hotel like a wounded bull, alerting the killer and destroying any chance of a subtle confession. Hamish needed to know why Graves was dead. In Beaton's world, millions of pounds were often less a motive than a bruised ego or a secret shame. He whistled for lugs and stepped back out into the rain, which had finally begun to taper off into a ghostly drizzle. Instead of following Blair to the hotel, Hamish doubled back toward the Mac Tavish cottage. There was something about the theatricality Priscilla had mentioned that bothered him. If Penhaligon wanted to frame Finch, why use a salmon? A dead fish was a message, one rooted in local tradition or a very specific personal joke. He found the cottage deserted, the yellow police tape fluttering dismally in the wind. He bypassed the well and went straight to the garage door, peering closely at the spray-painted letters. "Go home." It was the classic cry of the disgruntled local, yet the kerning of the letters was too precise, the hand too steady. A truly angry villager would have been messier, more hurried. This was a performance. He wandered into the back garden, where the mist clung to the overgrown rhododendrons. Hidden behind a shed, he found a discarded pair of blue latex gloves and a small, empty glass vial. He picked it up and sniffed. It wasn't wine. It was a concentrated essence of cloves and iron, a theatrical blood substitute used in stage productions. The motive began to shift in his mind. It was not just a resort development. Quentin Graves hadn't been killed for his money. He had been killed because he was an actor in a play he didn't realize was a tragedy. Hamish remembered something Priscilla had mentioned about a contract disagreement. He left the cottage and headed for the manse, the home of the local minister, Mr. Wellington. The minister was a man who knew the history of every soul in the Highlands, and more importantly, he knew the pedigree of the new money. He found the minister in his garden, unsuccessfully trying to protect his prize roses from the damp. "Hamish, my boy," the minister greeted him, leaning on his spade. "A dark day for the village. I trust Blair is being his usual charming self." "He's consistent, if nothing else, Minister," Hamish replied. "I am looking for a bit of history." This fellow Arthur Penhaligon, the name sounds familiar, but not in a way that suggests finance. "Does it ring any bells for you?" The minister wiped his brow, his eyes twinkling with a sudden memory. "Penhaligon? Oh, dear me, yes. Not Arthur, though. His father was Percival Penhaligon. He owned the very land that Finch and Graves were fighting over, long before the Sutherland estate absorbed it. The Penhaligons were an old gentry, Hamish, but they lost everything in a scandalous bankruptcy 20 years ago. Percival took his own life after a certain London liquidator stripped the estate bare. Hamish felt the chill of the har seep deeper into his coat. And would that liquidator happen to have been a young Quentin Graves? The very same, the minister sighed. It was a cold-blooded business. Graves didn't just buy the debt, he mocked the family's traditions while he did it. He even kept the family's ceremonial letter opener as a trophy. It had a silver eagle on the pommel, I believe. Hamish stood very still. The letter opener didn't belong to Finch at all. Finch had likely bought it at an estate auction, never knowing its history, but to Penhaligon it was a stolen heirloom. The murder wasn't about the resort, it was about a son watching the man who destroyed his father move back onto the family land to destroy it again. The theatrical nature of the Crymeth dinner jacket, the well, the silver eagle was a ritual of restoration. "Thank you, Minister," Hamish said, his voice grim. "You've been a great help." He turned away, his mind set. Penhaligon wasn't just a killer, he was a man finishing a story that had begun 2 decades ago. And now that he had framed Finch and killed Graves, there was only one person left who could connect the dots. Hamish knew he was being watched. He could feel eyes on him from the tree line. He needed to set a trap, and he needed to do it before Blair returned from his wild goose chase at the hotel. The mist seemed to thicken as Hamish walked away from the manse, swirling around him like the ghosts of the Penhaligons' lost inheritance. He knew the killer was nearby. Arthur Penhaligon had spent 20 years nursing a grievance that had finally curdled into a cold, meticulous violence. A man like that wouldn't simply flee, he would stay to witness the final act, to see the Sassenach rival Finch dragged away in chains, while the man who ruined his father lay rotting in a hole that once belonged to his ancestors. Hamish's boots clicked on the wet tarmac as he headed back toward the village centre, but he wasn't heading for the station. Instead, he made a deliberate detour toward the old harbour wall, a place where the wind howled and the visibility was even poorer than in the glen. He needed Penhaligon to believe that the lazy village bobby had stumbled onto something he couldn't handle. Hamish pulled his police radio from his belt, but he didn't key the mic for a real broadcast. Instead, he spoke loudly into the damp air, knowing that in the heavy silence of the Highlands, his voice would carry to anyone lurking in the shadows of the nearby boats. "Aye, headquarters. This is Macbeth," he drawled, his Highland accent becoming thick and syrupy. "Tell DCI Blair to forget the hotel. I've found the missing ledger from the Sutherland estate hidden in a lobster creel down by the pier. It's got all the names of the real buyers and the history of the Penhaligon debt. It looks like Graves wasn't the only one with blood on his hands. He'll be sitting at the end of the pier until the rain lets up, keeping an eye on it." He tucked the radio away and walked to the very end of the stone pier, where the dark waters of the loch churned against the weed-covered rocks. He sat down on a rusted mooring bollard, hunched his shoulders against the drizzle, and pulled a small, battered notebook from his pocket. To anyone watching, he looked like a man engrossed in incriminating evidence. Beside him, Luggs let out a low, vibrating growl, his hackles rising. Hamish reached down and patted the dog's head, his fingers grazing the hidden handle of his heavy torch. For 10 minutes, nothing happened but the crying of the gulls and the slap of water. Then, the sound of a soft footfall on stone reached his ears, a sound that didn't belong to the rhythmic splashing of the loch. It was the careful, balanced step of a man who had spent his life trying not to be noticed. "You're a persistent man, Macbeth," a voice said, emerging from the grey curtain of the hearth. Arthur Penhaligon stepped into view. Gone was the subservient, quiet shadow of the London financier. In his place stood a man with eyes as hard and cold as the flint in the mountains. He was holding a heavy, old-fashioned revolver, the bluing on the metal worn away by years of obsessive cleaning, and far more dangerous than that shouting buffoon from Strathbane. Hamish didn't look up from his notebook. "I am just a man who likes his tea and his peace, Mr. Penhaligon. It's horrible what happened to your father. But killing Graves and framing a fool like Finch won't bring the old estate back. It just adds more blood to the soil." Penhaligon let out a short, bark-like laugh. "It was never about the land, Macbeth. It was about the insult. Graves treated my family's history like a joke he could buy and sell. He laughed when he took that letter opener. He told my father it would make a fine tool for opening his bills. He deserved it. He deserved to die on the very land he stole. And the salmon?" Hamish asked, finally closing the notebook and looking up. "A bit of a Highland flourish, was it? A symbol of the life he tried to buy?" Penhaligon spat. "A wild thing trapped in a garden he didn't understand, just like him." He raised the revolver, his hand steady. "Now, give me that ledger. I can't have you ruining 20 years of patience with a bit of village gossip." Hamish stood up slowly, his tall frame unfolding like a pocket knife. "There is no ledger, Arthur. Just an old grocery list, and a few notes about the price of wool. I knew you couldn't resist a story about your father's legacy. It's the one thing you couldn't leave behind." Penhaligon's face contorted with a sudden, sharp realization. The very man he had dismissed as a peasant had tricked him. He tightened his grip on the trigger, but Hamish didn't wait. He whistled a sharp, piercing note that sent Luggs lunging forward like a white streak of fury, snapping at the killer's ankles. As Penhaligon flinched, Hamish stepped into the man's personal space with a speed that defied his lazy reputation, his large hand clamping down on the barrel of the gun. The struggle on the pier was not the graceful, choreographed combat of a television drama. It was a desperate, grunting affair of slipping boots and wet stone. Arthur Penhaligon, though smaller than Hamish, possessed the wire-thin strength of a man fueled by decades of suppressed rage. He fought with a feral intensity, trying to wrench the revolver free, but Hamish's hands, toughened by years of hauling peat and wrestling stubborn sheep, held the barrel with the immovable grip of a vice. Luggs was a white whirlwind of noise and teeth at Penhaligon's feet, his frantic barking echoing off the hull of a nearby trawler. "Drop it, Arthur!" Hamish commanded, his breath huffing out in white plumes. "The game's done. You've let the hate rot you through." Penhaligon didn't speak. He lashed out with a heavy boot, catching Hamish on the shin, and for a second, the policeman's footing faltered on the slime-covered rocks. They tumbled together toward the edge of the pier, the dark, freezing waters of the loch churning just inches away. The revolver went off with a deafening crack that shattered the stillness of the harbour, the bullet whining harmlessly into the mist. The recoil and the shock of the sound caused Penhaligon to loosen his grip for a heartbeat, and Hamish seized the moment. With a sudden surge of physical capability he rarely cared to display, he twisted the weapon from the killer's hand and sent it skittering across the stone, where it vanished into the deep with a dull splash. Left with only his hands, Penhaligon tried to scramble away, his eyes wild and darting toward the village. He made it 3 steps before Hamish lunged, tackling him into a stack of empty lobster creels. The wood splintered, the smell of old brine and rot filling the air as they crashed down. Hamish quickly pinned the man's arms behind his back, his weight ensuring there would be no second escape. "Let me go," Penhaligon hissed, his face pressed against the rough, salty wood. "You don't understand. Graves was the thief. He was the murderer. He killed my father as surely as if Head held the gun himself." "I do understand, Arthur," Hamish said, his voice surprisingly gentle as he reached for his handcuffs. "But you've turned yourself into the thing you hated. You used a silver eagle to settle a score, and all you've done is ensure that the Penhaligon name ends in a prison cell instead of a manor house." The click of the metal cuffs was a final, cold punctuation to the struggle. Penhaligon became limp, the fight draining out of him as quickly as the tide. He lay there among the broken creels, a broken man himself, shivering in the damp Highland air. Hamish stood up, brushing the dirt and salt from his uniform, his knee throbbing where it had struck the stone. He looked down at Lugs, who was now wagging his tail, looking quite pleased with his contribution to the arrest. "Good lad," Hamish murmured. He looked back toward the village, where the lights of the Lochdub Arms were beginning to twinkle through the fading har. He could hear the distant, angry drone of Blair's car returning from the hotel. The DCI would be in a foul mood, having found no evidence of wine reductions or botched confessions, and he would be looking for Hamish Head on a platter. Hamish pulled his radio out. He had the killer, he had the motive, and he had a confession witnessed by the very dog that was currently licking his hand. But as he looked at the shivering, defeated man at his feet, he felt no sense of triumph. He only felt a deep, weary desire to be back in his own kitchen with a pot of stew and the fire going. If he marched Penhaligon into the station now, he would be the hero of the hour. There would be commendations, journalists from the Glasgow papers, and, inevitably, the one thing Hamish feared most, a promotion to the city. He looked at Penhaligon, then at the flickering lights of the village. A plan began to form in his minder way to ensure justice was served without the unwanted side effect of professional success. He needed to make this look like Blair's victory, even if the DCI hadn't the wit to find a body in a bathtub. "Come on then, Arthur," Hamish said, hauling the man to his feet. "Let's get you out of the rain. We're going to have a little chat before the big man from Strathbane finds us. And if you play your cards right, you might just get to tell your story to someone who'll actually listen, even if he is a loud-mouthed bully." Hamish marched the shivering Penhaligon through the back alleys of Lochdub, avoiding the main street where the local busybodies might witness the capture. By the time they reached the rear entrance of the police station, the black sedan belonging to DCI Blair had already returned, parked crookedly across the pavement. Through the frosted glass of the station window, Hamish could see the silhouette of Blair pacing like a caged tiger, his arms waving in a rhythmic display of fury. He was likely halfway through a tirade about Hamish's frivolous theories regarding wine and allergies. Hamish stopped Penhaligon just outside the door, the shadows of the eaves concealing them. The killer looked hollowed out, the fire of his ancestral vengeance extinguished by the cold reality of the handcuffs. "Now listen closely, Arthur," Hamish whispered, leaning in so his tall frame towered over the smaller man. "Inside that room is a man with a very loud voice and a very small amount of patience. He wants to be a hero. If you tell him exactly what you told Mayhow you did it for your father, how you outsmarted the great Quentin Graves, and how you planted the evidence on that fool Finchhelby so busy preening himself, for the cameras that he might just forget to mention I had anything to do with it, Yow'll get your story in the papers, and I'll get to keep my quiet life. Do we have a deal?" Penhaligon gave a slow, sombre nod. He seemed to relish the idea of a grand stage for his grievance. Hamish reached out, adjusted the man's collar to make him look slightly more presentable, and then took a deep breath, schooling his features into a look of absolute, slack-jawed panic. He burst through the back door, stumbling slightly for effect. "Sir! Sir!" Hamish shouted, his voice cracking with feigned alarm. Blair spun around, his face turning a bruised plum shade. "Macbeth, you've got some nerve showing your face after that stunt at the hotel. There was no wine reduction, you carrot-topped imbecile. There was only a very confused chef and a very angry manager." Sorry, sir, truly," Hamish stammered, backing away as if cowed by the DCI's brilliance. I was completely wrong. I was wandering down by the harbour, feeling sorry for my stupidity, when this man here, he just ran right into me. He was carrying this. Hamish held up a small, mud-caked piece of evidence, head snatched from the Pierre silver monogrammed cufflink belonging to the victim. He started confessing everything, sir. I didn't even have to ask. He says he's the one who put the fellow in the well. Blair's eyes went wide as they landed on Penhaligon, who stood there with a tragic, dignified air. The DCI looked at the handcuffs, then at the cufflink, and then back at Hamish. The gears of his ambition turned visibly behind his bulging forehead. He could see the headlines, DCI Blair's presence in village scares killer into confession. Ran right into you, did he? Blair asked, his voice losing its edge and gaining a predatory smoothness. He stepped forward, shoving Hamish aside so he could loom over Penhaligon. I suppose my intensive questioning of the villagers made the perimeter too tight for you, eh? You realise there was no escape from the Strathbane CID. Penhaligon, catching Hamish's subtle wink, looked Blair squarely in the eye. Your investigation was relentless, Inspector. I knew it was only a matter of time before a man of your calibre saw through the distractions I set for the local help. Blair practically purred. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his tie as if the television cameras were already rolling. Naturally. Anderson, get the tape recorder. And someone got me a secure line to the chief constable. I've broken the case. He turned a dismissive shoulder to Hamish. As for you, Macbeth, get out of my sight. You nearly ruined this investigation with your amateurish meddling. It's only by the grace of my tactical positioning that this man didn't slip through the net. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir, Hamish mumbled, hanging his head in mock shame. He beat a hasty retreat toward the small kitchen at the back of the station, Lugs following at his heels with a wag of his tail that suggested the dog was in on the joke. As the sounds of Blair's self-important interrogation began to fill the front room, Hamish quietly put the kettle on. He had escaped the trap of a promotion, saved an innocent, if annoying, man from a life sentence, and ensured the real killer would have his day in court. Through the window, he saw the clouds finally parting, a sliver of pale Highland sun catching the mountainside. The whispers under the tartan sky were fading, replaced by the mundane, comforting sounds of a village returning to its routine. He reached into the cupboard for a tin of biscuits, feeling a sense of profound relief. He was still just the village bobby of Lochstub, and as far as he was concerned, that was the highest rank a man could ever hope to achieve. The sun finally broke through the stubborn Highland mist, casting long golden fingers across the village of Lochstub. The air felt scrubbed clean by the rain, carrying the sharp, sweet scent of wet heather and peat smoke. Outside the police station, the circus was finally packing up. DCI Blair was the centre of a small huddle of journalists who had raced up from Strathbane, his voice booming as he recounted his surgical precision in narrowing down the suspect pool. He looked every bit the triumphant conqueror, and he hadn't mentioned Hamish Macbeth's name on Suhitch was exactly how Hamish wanted it. Inside the station, the quiet was blissful. Alistair Finch had been released with a gruff apology from Sergeant Anderson and was currently outside, being interviewed by a local reporter. He was already embellishing his ordeal, claiming his stoic London resilience had seen him through the dark hours of false accusation. Hamish watched through the window as Finch gestured grandly toward his red sports car, which a village lad was currently scrubbing clean of spray paint for a tidy sum. Hamish turned away from the window and returned to his stove. He had a small iron pot simmering there, the savoury scent of a lamb stew beginning to fill the room. Lugs was sprawled out in a patch of sunlight on the floorboards, his paws twitching as he dreamed of catching silver-scaled fish. The heavy weight of the investigation had lifted, leaving behind only the familiar, comfortable ache of a job done and a life preserved. The door creaked open, and Priscilla Halberton-Smythe stepped in. She wasn't wearing her elegant conservatory attire today. Instead, she was in a rugged barber jacket and Wellingtons, looking perfectly at home in the Highland damp. She carried a small wicker basket, which she set on the desk next to Hamish's unfinished paperwork. "I brought some of the cook's fresh bannocks," she said, her eyes twinkling with that perceptive light Hamish found so unsettling. "I thought you might be hungry after your harrowing morning of doing absolutely nothing while Blair saved the day." Hamish allowed himself a small, rare smile as he lifted the lid of the stew pot to give it a stir. "Aye, it was a close-run thing, Priscilla. If Blair hadn't been here to provide the moral leadership, I don't know where we'd be." Priscilla laughed softly, a sound like clear water over stones. "You're a terrible liar, Hamish Macbeth. I saw you down by the harbour, and I've heard the whispers. The village knows it wasn't Blair who tracked Penhaligon into the mist. They also know why you let that buffoon take the credit. It's better this way," Hamish muttered, reaching for 2 bowls. "Blair gets his headlines and I stay here. If I were a hero, they'd have me behind a desk in a city where the air tastes of bus fumes and the tea is made with plastic bags. I am a simple man, Priscilla. I like my stew, I like my dog, and I like knowing whose sheep are where. They sat together in the small, cramped kitchen, the steam from the stew rising between them. For a moment, the romantic tension that always simmered under their friendship felt particularly sharp, but Hamish, as was his way, let the moment pass without a word. He knew the barriers between a village policeman and the daughter of a local squire were as high as the mountains of the Cuillin, and he was too tired to climb today. "What will happen to Penhaligon?" Priscilla asked after a moment of quiet eating. "Hell go away for a long time," Hamish said, his expression sombre. "But I think, in a strange way, he's found some peace." He told his story. He made sure the world knew what Graves did to his father. In the Highlands, a man's name is often the only thing he truly owns. He saved his father's name, even if he lost his own freedom to do it. As the afternoon light began to fade into a soft, purple twilight, Priscilla rose to leave. She paused at the door, looking back at the lanky policeman who seemed so perfectly in tune with the rugged landscape outside. "You're a good man, Hamish, even if you are the laziest policeman in Scotland. I prefer efficiently stationary," Hamish called after her. Once the door closed, the station returned to its natural state of profound tranquility. The radio gave an occasional, distant crackle, but no emergencies sought him out. Hamish finished his stew, washed the bowls with a slow, methodical care, and then settled into his armchair with a fresh pot of coffee. He pulled a tattered book from the side table, but he didn't open it. Instead, he simply sat, listening to the wind beginning to pick up again, whistling through the eaves of the old stone building. The mystery of the man in the well was over. The Sassenach rival was gone, the killer was in a cell, and the village of Lockdub had survived another intrusion from the outside world. Hamish closed his eyes, the heat of fire spreading through his limbs. Tomorrow he would have to deal with the unfiled reports and the disgruntled butcher, and perhaps he'd see that Salmon Head Herd was lurking in the dark pool below the bridge. But for tonight, the world was exactly as it should be, quiet, cold, and entirely his own.